December 11, 1941 was a day that would change the course of history. Just 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler made a decision that astonished the world. Without any obligation under the Tripartite Pact, Germany declared war on the United States. The reasoning behind this move remains one of the most debated moments in World War II history. Hitler believed that the United States, though powerful, was not yet fully mobilized for war and could be intimidated by a show of Axis unity. He also wanted to demonstrate solidarity with Japan and hoped that America would focus on the Pacific theater, leaving Europe to German dominance. The decision was made quickly, almost impulsively. On that morning, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop met with the American diplomatic representative in Berlin. The meeting lasted just 3 minutes. In that brief conversation, Ribbentrop handed over Germany's declaration of war. The American diplomat was stunned. There had been no warning, no negotiation, and no consultation with the German military. In fact, many senior officers were completely unaware that Hitler intended to make this declaration. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, had long feared a direct confrontation with the industrial and military might of the United States, yet Hitler dismissed their concerns entirely. Inside the corridors of power, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as a bold strategic gamble, while others recognized it as a reckless blunder. Hitler was convinced that Britain had been waiting for America to enter the European conflict, and he believed that by declaring war first, Germany could take control of the narrative. Meanwhile, intelligence reports underestimated the speed at which the United States could mobilize, and Hitler's overconfidence blinded him to the fact that America's industrial and human resources were virtually limitless. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt had been preparing for the possibility of American involvement in the war, but he faced political obstacles. Isolationist sentiment in Congress and among the public had restrained his ability to act directly. Hitler's declaration, however, solved this problem. When news reached Washington, Congress moved almost unanimously to declare war on Germany. This rapid and decisive response was exactly what Roosevelt needed to unite the nation behind the war effort. What makes this moment even more remarkable is the scale of miscalculation. Hitler assumed that the United States would be slow to respond, distracted by the Pacific, and unready for full-scale war. In reality, American industry and manpower mobilized faster than any European power could have imagined. Factories that had produced civilian goods switched almost overnight to tanks, aircraft, and ships. Millions of young Americans volunteered for service, creating a force that would grow to over 16 million by the time the war reached its peak. In the shadows of this declaration, Germany's military planners realized too late the consequences. Hitler had transformed a regional conflict into a truly global war, pulling the United States directly into the European theater. The Third Reich now faced an opponent with unmatched industrial capacity, an almost limitless pool of soldiers, and the ability to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. What had seemed like a strategic gesture of solidarity with Japan turned into a catastrophic miscalculation that would shape the outcome of the war. By the end of the day, the ripple effects were already visible. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill reportedly declared the war won the moment he heard the news, understanding that America's entry into the European conflict would tip the balance decisively. Meanwhile, German leaders were left grappling with the enormity of what had just occurred, realizing that Hitler's impulsive choice had unleashed forces far beyond their control. The declaration of war was not just a diplomatic act, it was a turning point that set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Third Reich and reshaped the global order forever. When Germany declared war on the United States, the reaction across America was swift and decisive. On December 11, 1941, the country that had spent years debating isolationism suddenly found itself fully committed to a global conflict. Congress convened immediately, and within hours, the vote to declare war on Germany was unanimous. The nation, long hesitant to intervene in European affairs, was now united behind President Franklin D. Roosevelt. What had been a political challenge for Roosevelt transformed overnight into an opportunity. The American people, outraged by the attack on Pearl Harbor and now by Germany's aggression, rallied behind the war effort with unprecedented energy. Roosevelt's administration moved quickly to mobilize both industry and manpower. Factories that had once produced consumer goods were rapidly converted to produce tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ships. The automotive industry, led by companies like Ford and General Motors, became an engine of war production. In just a few months, American factories were capable of producing thousands of planes every month, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of ships. The United States, once hesitant to enter the European war, suddenly became the most powerful industrial nation on the planet. At the same time, millions of Americans volunteered or were drafted into military service. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 had already established a peacetime draft, but the War Declaration accelerated recruitment at an unprecedented rate. By the end of 1942, over 5 million men had entered the armed forces, and the number would continue to grow. Roosevelt understood that this surge of manpower, combined with industrial capacity, would give the Allies a decisive advantage in the long run. Meanwhile, Germany's leaders were watching in disbelief. Hitler had assumed that America would be slow to act and unprepared for war, but the reality was entirely different. The United States quickly coordinated with Britain to plan joint operations, share intelligence, and establish supply lines. Lend-Lease programs, which had previously sent weapons and equipment to Allied nations, now took on even greater importance as America prepared for a full-scale war in Europe. The industrial and logistical machinery of the United States was unmatched, and Germany had no capacity to counter it effectively. This declaration also transformed public perception and morale. The American people, once divided on the question of involvement, now felt a clear sense of purpose. Propaganda, newsreels, and radio broadcasts emphasized unity, duty, and the moral imperative of defeating fascism. Factories and military training camps became symbols of national determination. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, producing munitions and supplies, and demonstrating that the war effort extended far beyond the battlefield. Strategically, the declaration of war removed any remaining barriers to American military planning. Roosevelt could now coordinate a European strategy without the constraints of domestic isolationist opposition. Naval convoys, bombing campaigns, and troop deployments were planned on a scale that would have been politically impossible just days earlier. The United States was no longer a distant observer, it was a central actor in the fight against the Axis. By the end of 1941, the stage was set for a new phase of World War II. The combination of American industry, manpower, and political unity created a force that Germany had never anticipated. Hitler's gamble had, paradoxically, strengthened the very nation he sought to intimidate. Within months, the effects would be felt on the battlefields of the Atlantic, in the skies over Europe, and on the shores of Africa. The world had changed overnight, and America's entry into the war marked the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately decide the fate of the Third Reich.
With Germany's declaration of war, what had been a conflict confined to the Pacific immediately became a global struggle. The United States, already reeling from Pearl Harbor, was now fully engaged on two fronts. In Europe, Britain, long standing alone against Hitler's forces, suddenly had a powerful new ally. Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognized the significance instantly. The war was no longer a battle of endurance for Britain alone. The United States brought unmatched industrial might, manpower, and strategic vision to the fight. The entry of America into the European theater changed calculations at every level. German intelligence had underestimated the speed and scale at which the United States could project power overseas. Within weeks, American troops were being deployed to Britain, preparing for operations in North Africa and eventually the liberation of Europe. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from U-boats, yet the sheer volume of supplies made it impossible for Germany to halt the flow. Tanks, aircraft, food, and ammunition poured into Allied hands, creating an unstoppable momentum that Hitler could not anticipate. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic became a deadly chess game. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hoping to choke off the supply lines, but the United States quickly implemented convoy systems, long-range aircraft patrols, and advanced sonar technology. For every ship sunk, two more took its place. The Atlantic, once Germany's potential route to victory, became a corridor of Allied power projection. The sheer scale of American industrial and logistical support overwhelmed German planning, demonstrating that no nation had ever mobilized resources so quickly in the history of warfare. On land, the psychological impact was equally profound. Hitler had expected that America's entry into the war might be hesitant, cautious, and politically divided. Instead, Americans moved with precision and purpose. Training camps expanded, and American soldiers adapted rapidly to the rigors of overseas deployment. Coordinated planning with British forces led to combined strategies for North Africa, Sicily, and ultimately the invasion of France. Every German calculation, from logistics to troop movements, had to account for this new, formidable adversary. The global scope of the war also had diplomatic consequences. Neutral countries, once skeptical of the Allies' ability to resist Germany, now recognized that the balance of power had shifted. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, could anticipate increased Allied support in the months to come. Japan, meanwhile, had drawn the United States into the Pacific conflict, but Germany's move ensured that America's full attention and resources would ultimately stretch across multiple theaters simultaneously. By transforming a regional conflict into a truly global war, Hitler had inadvertently strengthened the Allies. The decision to declare war on the United States brought an opponent with unmatched industrial capacity, vast manpower, and strategic vision directly into the European theater. Every battle plan, every strategic decision, every calculation made by the German High Command had to now consider a nation that could replace losses almost instantly, build weapons faster than Germany could destroy them, and fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The implications were clear. What Germany thought would intimidate and delay America instead unleashed a force that would reshape the war. The alliance between Britain and the United States became the backbone of the Allied strategy. The global war, once feared and distant, was now immediate, expansive, and unstoppable. Hitler's gamble had turned a regional confrontation into the most comprehensive conflict in human history, setting the stage for campaigns that would eventually stretch from the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Berlin and ultimately lead to the collapse of the Third Reich.
The entry of the United States into the European War unleashed an industrial power unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods were transformed almost overnight into engines of war. Assembly lines that had built automobiles now produced tanks, airplanes, and artillery at staggering rates. The United States became what President Roosevelt famously called the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own military, but also providing critical support to allied nations fighting on multiple fronts. By the middle of 1942, American production numbers were staggering. Over 300,000 aircraft would be built during the course of the war, each one faster, stronger, and more advanced than anything Germany could counter in sufficient numbers. Tanks rolled off assembly lines at the rate of hundreds per month, while the Navy expanded to include thousands of new ships, ensuring that supply lines across the Atlantic remained open despite the persistent threat of German U-boats. Every factory, every worker, every engineer became part of a national war machine. The workforce itself underwent a transformation. Millions of men entered the armed forces, but those left behind, particularly women, took their place in the factories. Known as Rosie the Riveter, these women assembled aircraft wings, riveted tanks, and built munitions, proving that the war effort extended far beyond the battlefield. Their contribution was critical, and their efficiency allowed production to soar to levels that the Axis powers simply could not match. The U.S. had not just joined the war, it had redefined what was possible in modern warfare. The impact on Germany was profound. Hitler had assumed that the United States would take time to mobilize, that its industrial capacity would be constrained by geography and peacetime routines. Instead, American factories seemed limitless, producing weapons faster than German forces could destroy them. Every new convoy across the Atlantic, every new shipment of tanks and aircraft to Britain shifted the balance further in favor of the Allies. German planners quickly realized that their U-boat campaign, while initially threatening, could not stop the flood of resources, and their Luftwaffe could not match the scale of Allied production. This industrial might directly enabled strategic operations that would define the European theater. In North Africa, American equipment helped push Axis forces out of Libya and Tunisia. In Italy, tanks, artillery, and supplies allowed Allied forces to advance despite difficult terrain and entrenched German defenses. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the Allies had amassed over 150,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and an air force that could dominate the skies. Every element of the invasion relied on the industrial foundation that America had built in response to Hitler's declaration of war. The sheer scale of mobilization also had a psychological impact. German leaders watching from Berlin recognized that they were now facing an opponent with unmatched capacity and relentless determination. The war had become a contest not just of strategy, but of resources, logistics, and endurance. Every ship, tank, and plane produced in American factories was a statement. Germany could not hope to outlast this new enemy. By the end of 1942, it was clear that the United States had transformed the European war. The combination of industrial output, manpower, and innovation created a force that could overwhelm even the most entrenched German positions. Hitler's decision to declare war, intended as a show of strength, had triggered a response that Germany could never counter. The arsenal of democracy was fully engaged, and the tide of the war had begun to turn irreversibly against the Third Reich. By the time news of Germany's declaration reached London, Winston Churchill immediately recognized its monumental significance. For Britain, the war had been a test of endurance, withstanding relentless bombings, U-boat attacks, and a continent dominated by Axis forces. Yet Churchill reportedly declared the war won the moment he heard that America had been drawn into the European conflict. He understood that the combined industrial, military, and logistical power of the United States would tip the balance irreversibly. The entry of America was not just a reinforcement, it was a turning point that Germany had neither anticipated nor prepared for. For the Third Reich, the consequences were catastrophic. Hitler's decision had bypassed his own generals, ignored strategic risks, and underestimated the enemy's capabilities. Germany now faced a two-ocean war, with an opponent capable of producing thousands of tanks, aircraft, and ships at a pace unmatched anywhere else in the world. The Wehrmacht, stretched across multiple fronts and already engaged with the Soviet Union, could not compete with an adversary whose resources seemed limitless. Every offensive plan, every strategic maneuver was now overshadowed by the sheer scale of American mobilization. The sense of inevitability began to permeate German command. The ripple effects extended far beyond military calculations. American forces began building bases in Britain, North Africa, and eventually across continental Europe. Supply lines ensured that every Allied front was reinforced and resupplied faster than Germany could respond. Operation Torch in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, and ultimately D-Day in Normandy relied on the unprecedented output of American factories and the millions of service members who had been trained, equipped, and deployed. Each battle, each landing, each air raid was a testament to the industrial and human capacity unleashed by Hitler's fateful declaration. Politically, the declaration solved Roosevelt's greatest challenge, uniting the American public behind a global conflict. Isolationist opposition evaporated, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and moral imperative. Factories, farms, and communities across the United States became part of a national effort to defeat fascism. The mobilization reshaped society, accelerated technological innovation, and demonstrated that the U.S. could project power on a scale never before imagined. Americans realized that the war effort touched every aspect of life, from the assembly line to the battlefield, and even into the laboratories where new weapons and strategies were developed. In hindsight, the declaration of war was the moment that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Hitler had transformed a strategic gamble into a decisive disadvantage. By drawing the United States fully into the European theater, he had unleashed forces that Germany could not counter. The Allies' eventual victories in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself were built on the foundation of American industrial might, strategic coordination, and military power. Each success traced back, in part, to the impulsive decision made in a borrowed opera house in Berlin. Ultimately, December 11, 1941, was more than a diplomatic act. It was a turning point that reshaped world history. One man's decision, made without consultation and against the advice of his generals, accelerated the downfall of the Third Reich. Churchill's optimism, Roosevelt's leadership, and the relentless output of American industry converged to change the trajectory of the war. The United States had entered the European theater, and the world would never be the same. What began as a calculated risk for Hitler ended as the single most consequential moment in determining the outcome of World War II. The consequences of that day would echo for decades, reshaping global politics, military strategy, and the very nature of modern warfare.